An elderly couple, abandoned by their children, built a home inside a giant tree that no one could see. After years of silence, unanswered calls, and forgotten birthdays, they vanished into the forest and carved a secret sanctuary beneath the roots of a 400-year-old Douglas fir. But here's where it gets shocking. Their 5 successful children only came looking when they needed something. A signature worth $4 million. One son finds the hidden hatch. He stands right above his parents, his hand on the wood, ready to open it. But what he discovers about himself stops him cold. Now, the parents hold all the power, and they're not sure their children deserve to be found. Will they open the door to forgiveness, or will they let their own family search forever for a home they'll never see? The call came on a Tuesday morning in late October, and it wasn't about love. Richard Harmon was sitting in his corner office on the 32nd floor of a glass tower in Chicago when his phone lit up with his sister's name. He almost let it go to voicemail. Catherine only called when she needed something, and Richard had a meeting in 15 minutes with clients worth more than his parents' entire lives combined. But something made him answer. Maybe it was the fact that she'd called twice already that morning. Maybe it was the way his coffee had gone cold without him noticing, a sign he was more distracted than he'd admitted. "We have a problem," Catherine said before he could even say hello. "Good morning to you too." "Richard, I'm serious. The Whitfield Group needs Dad's signature on the mineral rights transfer. Without it, the sale doesn't close." Richard leaned back in his leather chair. The Whitfield deal. He'd almost forgotten. 3 years ago, their parents had signed over power of attorney for most of their assets. But the mineral rights to the old family property in eastern Oregon had slipped through the cracks. A technicality, really. Nobody had expected those rights to be worth anything. Then Whitfield discovered lithium deposits on adjacent land and suddenly wanted everything in a 50-mile radius. "So call him," Richard said. "Have him sign it and overnight the documents." The silence on the other end lasted 2 beats too long. "I tried," Catherine said. "The number's disconnected." "Then drive out there." "Richard," his sister's voice dropped to something almost like embarrassment. "I don't actually know where they live now." Richard set down his coffee cup. "What do you mean you don't know where they live? They're our parents. When's the last time you visited them?" The question landed like a slap. Richard opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He thought back. The funeral for Uncle Martin had been 3 years ago? 4? And even then, he'd flown in and out the same day, barely speaking to his mother and father beyond the obligatory condolences. "They moved," Catherine continued, "after we sold the house. We didn't sell the house. They sold the house. Richard, we convinced them to sell the house. We told them it was too much for them to maintain, that they'd be better off in that retirement community in Bend. Remember?" He remembered. He remembered his mother crying in the kitchen of the home where she'd raised 5 children, signing papers she didn't fully understand because her son with the law degree told her it was the right thing to do. He remembered his father standing in the doorway with a face like stone, saying nothing, which was somehow worse than if he'd screamed. "They left the retirement community," Catherine said, 8 months after they moved in. "The administrator called me about it at the time, but I was in the middle of the Henderson merger, and I assumed they'd figure it out." "You assumed they'd figure it out? Don't take that tone with me. When's the last time you even called them?" Richard couldn't answer that either. "I called Derek, Michael, and Susan," Catherine continued, naming their 3 other siblings. "Nobody knows where Mom and Dad are." Derek thought they might have moved closer to Michael in Portland, but Michael hasn't heard from them in over a year, Susan said. She paused. Susan said she sent them a Christmas card last year, and it came back marked, "Return to sender, address unknown." Richard stood up and walked to the window. 32 floors below, Chicago moved like a living thing, cars and people flowing through concrete veins. Somewhere out there, in a country that suddenly seemed very large, his 78-year-old parents had vanished. "How is this possible?" he asked. "People don't just disappear." "Old people do," Catherine said quietly. "Old people nobody's looking for." The meeting with the clients went poorly. Richard couldn't focus. He kept thinking about his father's hands, the ones that had built their childhood treehouse, fixed every broken bicycle, changed the oil in every car Richard had ever owned until he left for college. He thought about his mother's voice, how she used to call every Sunday without fail until, at some point, she stopped. He couldn't remember when. He couldn't remember if he'd noticed. That evening, Richard flew to Portland. Michael picked him up at the airport, and the two brothers drove through the night toward eastern Oregon, toward the town where they'd grown up, toward a house that now belonged to strangers. "I keep thinking about the last time I saw them," Michael said, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "It was at the retirement community. Mom had made pot roast in that tiny kitchenette, and Dad just sat there staring out the window the whole time. I thought he was being stubborn. You know how he gets." "Gets," Richard corrected. "What?" "You said gets, present tense." "He's not dead, Michael. We don't know that anything's wrong. Maybe they just wanted privacy. Maybe they're traveling." But even as he said it, Richard knew how hollow it sounded. Their parents didn't travel. Their parents had lived in the same house for 43 years, knew every neighbor by name, had a routine so predictable you could set your watch by it. The idea of them wandering the country at 78 was absurd. They reached the town at 3 in the morning. Nothing was open. They sat in the parking lot of a gas station and watched the stars wheel overhead, and Richard tried to remember the last time he'd seen stars like this. So many they seemed to press down on the earth with their weight. "We're terrible sons," Michael said. It wasn't a question. Richard didn't argue. The next morning, they started asking questions. They went to the retirement community first, but the staff who'd been there when their parents left had since moved on. The current administrator, a harried woman named Patricia, found the file after 20 minutes of searching. "They gave 30 days notice," she said, flipping through papers. "Very proper about it. Your father came in and signed everything himself. He didn't leave a forwarding address." She looked up. "We tried calling the emergency contacts on file, but no one answered." Richard looked at the emergency contact list. His name was first. His number hadn't changed in 15 years. "Were there calls?" he asked. Patricia checked her notes. 3 attempts over 2 weeks. "After that, we closed the file. They'd paid up their account. There wasn't really anything else we could do." 3 calls. His parents had reached out 3 times, and he'd been too busy to answer. Or maybe the calls had come at inconvenient moments, and he'd told himself he'd call back later. How many laters had there been? How many had added up to years? They drove to the old house next, the one where they'd grown up. A young family lived there now. A husband and wife with 2 small children who played in the front yard where Richard once learned to ride a bike. The wife was friendly, but couldn't help. She'd never met the previous owners. The sale had been handled entirely through agents. "We found a few things in the attic when we moved in," she said. "Some old photographs, a couple of boxes of papers. I meant to track down the sellers and return them, but life got busy. You know how it is." Richard knew exactly how it was. The boxes were still in her garage. She let them take everything. Michael loaded the boxes into the trunk while Richard stood in the driveway, looking at the house where his parents had raised 5 children, celebrated 40 anniversaries, and grown old together. The new owners had painted it blue. His mother had always wanted it blue, but his father had insisted on white because it was easier to maintain. "She finally got her blue house," Richard said. Michael didn't answer. He was looking at something in one of the boxes, his face pale. "What is it?" Michael held up a stack of envelopes, bound together with a rubber band. They were cards, Christmas cards and birthday cards, and thinking of you cards, all addressed to the 5 Harmon children, all marked "Return to Sender." Richard took the stack and flipped through them. 23 cards in total. The postmarks spanned 2 years. His mother had kept trying for 2 years after they left the retirement community, sending cards to addresses where her children no longer lived or never checked their mail. At the bottom of the stack was a letter. It wasn't in an envelope. It was written on plain paper, in his mother's careful handwriting, and it was dated 18 months ago. "To our children, if you're reading this, then perhaps you finally came looking. We waited a long time for you to call, to visit, to remember that we existed. Your father says I shouldn't be angry, that you have your own lives now, your own families, your own worries. He's always been better at forgiveness than me. We've decided to stop waiting. There's no point in staying somewhere we're not wanted. We're going somewhere we can be useful again, somewhere we can build something with our own hands instead of sitting in that little apartment watching television until we die. Don't worry about us. We've taken care of each other for 52 years. We don't need anything from you that you're not willing to give freely. I used to dream that one day all 5 of you would come home at the same time, that we'd sit around the table like we used to, that I'd cook too much food and your father would complain about the noise but secretly love it. I've stopped dreaming that now. Some things aren't meant to be. If you find us, It will be because you wanted to, not because you needed something. And if you never find us, then I suppose this letter will sit in a box somewhere until someone throws it away. We love you. We always have. We always will. But love isn't enough if it only goes one direction. Mom. Richard read the letter 3 times. Each time, it hurt worse. There's an address, Michael said. He was holding another piece of paper, a receipt from a hardware store in a town called Millbrook, about 60 miles east. This was in the same box. It's from 14 months ago. Someone bought lumber, roofing materials, and a concrete mix. Paid cash. That doesn't mean it was them. The signature on the receipt is Dad's. I'd recognize it anywhere. Richard took the receipt, his father's handwriting, cramped and precise, spelling out Donald Harmon at the bottom. A purchase of building materials worth over $2,000. What would 2 people in their late 70s need with that much lumber? They drove to Millbrook. It took an hour on winding roads that cut through forest so dense the sunlight barely penetrated. The town itself was barely a town, just a cluster of buildings around a single intersection. A general store, a post office, a diner, a gas station. The kind of place that existed because someone had built it 100 years ago and nobody had bothered to tear it down. The hardware store was run by a man named Garrett, mid-60s, with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too much weather. He looked at the receipt for a long time before speaking. I remember them, he said. Nice couple, quiet, paid cash for everything, which is unusual these days. Most folks around here run tabs. Do you know where they went? Richard asked. Garrett studied him. You're the son? One of them. They mentioned they had children, 5 of them, all successful. He said the word successful like it tasted sour, said they were proud of you, said you were all very busy. Richard felt the heat rise to his face. We're trying to find them now. Why? The question was so direct that Richard didn't have an answer ready. Because we need their signature was the truth, but he couldn't say that out loud. Not to this stranger who was looking at him like he already knew. Because they're our parents, Michael said. Because we're worried about them. Garrett kept looking at Richard, not at Michael. Worried. That's a word for it. He handed back the receipt. They came in here maybe 6, 7 times over the course of a few months. Bought all kinds of supplies, lumber, insulation, a wood stove, piping. Looked like they were building something substantial. I asked once if they needed help with delivery, but the old man, your father, said he'd handle it himself. Did he say where? Somewhere up in the national forest. That's all I know. People around here don't ask too many questions about where folks live. Lot of land out there, most of it empty. Someone wants to disappear. They can disappear. Richard felt the word disappear settle into his chest like a stone. His parents had disappeared, on purpose. Because their children had made them feel so unwanted that vanishing into a forest seemed preferable to waiting for phone calls that never came. Is there anyone else they might have talked to? Michael asked. Anyone who might know more specifically where they went? Garrett thought for a moment. There's a woman named Ruth who runs the diner across the street. Your mother came in there sometimes for coffee. They got to talking, I think. Ruth might know more. Ruth was 70 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a braid and hands that never stopped moving, wiping counters, refilling coffee cups, adjusting napkin dispensers. The diner was nearly empty at 2 in the afternoon, just an old man in the corner working through a piece of pie and a young couple by the window whispering to each other. Helen and Donald, Ruth said when they showed her a photograph. Of course I remember them. Lovely people. She'd come in every Thursday for coffee and pie. We'd talk about our grandchildren. She paused. Well, I'd like to talk about my grandchildren. Helen would mostly listen. Do you know where they're living? Richard asked. Ruth's expression cooled slightly. You're the children. Yes? The busy ones. Richard didn't have an answer for that either. Helen told me about you, Ruth said. 5 children, all grown, all with good jobs and nice houses. She was proud of you. She was also, Ruth hesitated. She was sad. She didn't say it outright, but I could tell. A mother knows when another mother's heart is broken. We need to find them, Michael said. It's important. Important to whom? To us. We want to make sure they're okay. Ruth looked at them for a long moment, the way Garrett had, as if measuring something invisible. They're okay, she said finally. Better than okay. They found something out there, I think. A purpose. Helen told me once that she'd spent her whole life taking care of other people, and now, for the first time, she and Donald were taking care of each other. just the two of them. She said it was like being young again. "Please," Richard said. "If you know where they are." "I don't know exactly. Somewhere up in the old-growth section of the forest, near the ridge." That's all Helen ever said. She was protective of it, said it was the first thing that had ever been just theirs. She turned back to the coffee pot, signaling that the conversation was over. Richard and Michael stood in the parking lot of the diner, looking up at the wall of green that rose behind the town. Somewhere in there, in thousands of acres of ancient forest, their parents had built a home. They'd built it themselves, with their own aging hands, with lumber and nails, and a determination that Richard couldn't fully comprehend. "How do we even start looking?" Michael asked. Richard didn't know. He pulled out his phone to call Catherine, to update her, to ask what they should do next. But as he dialed, something his mother had written in that letter kept echoing in his mind. "If you find us, it will be because you wanted to, not because you needed something." He thought about the Whitfield deal, about the signature that had brought them here. He thought about his corner office and his leather chair and the meeting he'd blown because he couldn't stop thinking about his father's hands. "Maybe we don't start looking today," Richard said slowly. "Maybe we sit down and figure out what we're actually doing here." Michael stared at him. "We're looking for Mom and Dad. Are we? Or are we looking for a signature?" The question hung in the air between them, uncomfortable and true. And somewhere, miles away, up a mountain and through trees so old they'd been alive when this country was born, an old man lifted a hidden wooden hatch and climbed down into the earth, where his wife sat on their bed in a room carved from the roots of a giant Douglas fir, sipping coffee by firelight, smiling at the sound of his footsteps. "Any trouble?" she asked. "None," Donald Harmon said, hanging his coat on a peg made from a bent branch. Picked up the supplies, saw no one who mattered. Another quiet day. At his feet, a dog with graying fur wagged its tail and turned 3 circles before settling on its bed. Helen held out a cup of coffee, steam rising in the warm air of their impossible home. "Good," she said. "I like our quiet days." Donald sat down beside her and took the cup. Outside, above them, the forest kept its secrets. And far below, in the town, their sons were just beginning to understand what they'd lost. The home beneath the Douglas fir had taken 11 months to build. Donald Harmon still remembered the first time he'd seen the tree, standing at the edge of a clearing where the forest floor dipped into a natural depression. The tree was ancient, maybe 400 years old, its trunk so wide that 3 men holding hands couldn't have circled it. The roots spread out like the fingers of a giant hand, creating hollows and cavities where the earth had eroded over centuries. He'd been walking for hours that day, following old logging roads that had been reclaimed by nature, trying to outpace the weight in his chest. Helen was back at the motel in Millbrook, lying in bed with the curtains drawn, not crying anymore because she'd run out of tears. They'd left the retirement community 3 days earlier with nothing but their savings, their truck, and a dog named Buster who was too old and too loyal to leave behind. Donald had no plan. For the first time in 52 years of marriage, he had no plan. He'd always been the one who knew what came next, who could look at a problem and see the solution hiding inside it. But this problem had no solution. His children had forgotten him, not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, gradually, the way a river forgets the stones it once flowed around. They'd simply moved on, and he and Helen had been left behind like furniture in an empty house. The tree changed everything. Donald stood at its base and looked up at the canopy, so high it seemed to touch the clouds. He looked at the roots, at the hollows beneath them, at the way the ground sloped down into a natural bowl. And somewhere in his mind, a door opened. He could build here, not a cabin, which would be visible from the air and require permits he'd never get. Something else, something hidden. A home carved into the earth itself, sheltered by roots and soil, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. It was crazy. He was 76 years old. His back ached every morning, his hands weren't as steady as they'd been, and his heart had already given him one warning that he'd chosen to ignore. Building an underground home in the middle of a national forest was the kind of idea a young man might have, a young man with time and strength and nothing to lose. But Donald Harmon had nothing to lose either. That was the thing his children didn't understand. When you take away everything that matters to a man, you don't make him weak, you make him dangerous. You make him free. He went back to the motel that night and told Helen what he'd found. You want to live in a hole in the ground, she said. It wasn't a question. I want to live somewhere that's ours. Somewhere nobody can take from us. Somewhere we don't have to wait for phone calls that never come or visits that never happen. Helen was quiet for a long time. Buster lay between them on the bed, his graying muzzle resting on his paws. Can you really build it? She asked finally. At your age? I built our first house with my own hands when I was 24. I built the addition when the twins came. I built that treehouse the kids loved so much, and the deck and the workshop. He took her hand. I've got one more build left in me, Helen. I know I do, and I want it to be for us. Just us. She looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen in years. Hope, small and fragile, but there. Show me, she said. The next morning, they drove out to the forest together. Donald led her along the overgrown road, then off into the trees, following markers he'd left the day before. When they reached the clearing, Helen stood very still, looking at the ancient tree the way a person looks at a cathedral. Oh, Donald, she whispered. I know. It's beautiful. I know. She walked to the base of the tree and pressed her palm against the bark. It's been here for hundreds of years, longer than our country, longer than anyone's memory. And nobody knows about it. Nobody comes here. I walked for 6 hours yesterday and didn't see another soul. Helen turned to face him. She was 74 years old, her hair gone white, her body carrying the weight of decades. But when she smiled, Donald saw the girl he'd married, the one who'd agreed to build a life with him when he had nothing but calloused hands and big dreams. Okay, she said, let's build our home. They started that week. Donald drew plans on graph paper, measuring the space between roots, calculating load-bearing requirements, figuring out how to create a structure that would be invisible from above and waterproof from below. He drove to hardware stores in 3 different towns, paying cash, never buying too much at once, never giving his real name. Helen worked beside him every day. She couldn't do the heavy lifting, but she could hand him tools, hold boards steady, mix concrete in small batches. She brought him water and made him rest when his face got too red. She talked to him while he worked, telling him stories about their children when they were young, back when the family had been whole, back when Sunday dinners meant something. Buster supervised from the shade, too old to help, but too devoted to stay behind. The basic structure took 4 months. Donald dug into the hillside beneath the roots, creating a space roughly 20 feet by 15 feet, with a ceiling just high enough to stand. He reinforced the walls with lumber, creating a frame that would hold back the earth. He lined everything with plastic sheeting, then with insulation, then with plywood panels that Helen painted white to reflect the light. The entrance was the trickiest part. It had to be invisible. Donald built a hatch disguised as part of the forest floor, covered with real soil and moss and scattered leaves. You could stand 3 feet away and never know it was there. The hatch opened onto a ladder that descended 8 feet into the main room. They installed a small wood stove with a chimney that Donald routed through the roots of the tree, emerging far from the entrance so the smoke would dissipate among the branches. They built a bed frame from pine, a table from oak, chairs from whatever wood Donald could find. Helen sewed curtains from fabric she bought in town, even though there were no windows. A home needs curtains, she said, and that was that. By the time winter came, they had walls, a floor, a ceiling, a stove, and each other. They had running water from a spring Donald had diverted through PVC pipes. They had a composting toilet in a small side chamber. They had shelves lined with canned goods, oil lamps for light, and a battery-powered radio that picked up stations from as far away as Portland. They had, against all odds, a home. The first night they slept underground, Helen cried. But they were different tears than the ones she'd cried in the motel. These were tears of relief, of wonder, of gratitude. We did it, she said in the darkness, her voice muffled against Donald's shoulder. We actually did it. We did. Nobody knows we're here. Nobody. Not even the children. Donald was quiet for a moment. No, not even them. Helen pulled back and looked at him, though neither could see the other's face. Do you think they'll ever come looking? I don't know. Do you want them to? It was a question Donald had been avoiding for months. The honest answer was complicated. Part of him wanted his children to burst through the door, to fall to their knees, to beg for forgiveness. Part of him wanted them to understand what they'd done, to feel even a fraction of the pain they'd caused. But another part of him, a part that grew larger every day, simply didn't care anymore. "I want them to want to," he said finally, "but I'm done waiting for it." Helen was quiet, processing this. Then, she took his hand in the darkness. "Me too," she said. The seasons turned. Winter melted into spring, and Donald expanded the home. He added a second room, smaller than the first, which became Helen's space for the sewing and quilting she'd always loved but never had time for when she was raising 5 children. He built a root cellar within the root cellar, a deeper chamber where they could store vegetables from the small garden Helen planted in the clearing above, camouflaged among wild plants to look like natural growth. Summer brought warmth and long days. Helen would sit outside in the mornings, hidden by the trees, drinking coffee and listening to birds. Donald would work on projects: a better rainwater collection system, a smokehouse for preserving meat, a small chicken coop disguised as a deadfall. Buster would lie in patches of sunlight, his arthritis easing in the heat. They talked more than they had in years. Not about the children, not about the past, but about everything else. Books they'd read, places they'd dreamed of visiting, memories from before they were parents, when they were just 2 young people figuring out how to love each other. "I forgot how much I like you," Helen said one evening, as they sat by the fire in their underground home, the world above them silent and dark. Donald looked at her. "You forgot?" "Not forgot, but lost track of. We spent so many years being mom and dad, we forgot how to be Donald and Helen." He understood exactly what she meant. Somewhere along the way, they'd stopped being people and become functions. Mom who cooked and cleaned and worried, Dad who worked and fixed things and paid bills. The children had seen them as utilities, reliable and invisible, like electricity or running water, something you only noticed when it stopped working. "I like being Donald," he said. Helen smiled. "I like you being Donald too." Buster, sensing the moment, thumped his tail against the floor. They developed routines. Donald would go to town every 2 weeks for supplies, always varying which town, always paying cash, always keeping conversations short. Helen would stay behind, tending the garden, preparing meals, writing in the journal she'd started keeping. She wrote about the weather, about the plants, about the animals they saw. She wrote about Donald, about the way he hummed while he worked, about the surprising gentleness of his hands when he didn't think anyone was watching. She didn't write about the children, not anymore. Once, about 8 months after they'd moved into the home beneath the tree, a hiker passed, within 50 yards of their clearing. Donald and Helen were inside, and they heard footsteps above, heard the crackle of someone moving through underbrush. Buster's ears went up, and Helen put her hand over his muzzle to keep him quiet. They sat in absolute stillness for 10 minutes until the sounds faded into the distance. "That was close," Helen whispered. "But not close enough," Donald said. "No one's going to find us unless we want to be found." That night, Helen asked him again, "Do you think they'll ever look? The children?" "Yes." Donald considered the question seriously. He thought about Richard, the oldest, the lawyer with the corner office who'd explained in patient, condescending detail why selling the house was the right decision. He thought about Catherine, the businesswoman, who'd scheduled their move to the retirement community around her merger timeline like they were items on a spreadsheet. He thought about Derek, Michael, and Susan, the younger 3, who'd simply followed their older siblings' lead, too busy with their own lives to question whether abandoning their parents was the right thing to do. "They might," he said, "if they need something. That's not the same as wanting to find us." "No, it's not." Helen was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised him. "I hope they do come looking, not because I want to go back, but because I want them to see what we built. I want them to know that we didn't just survive without them. We thrived." Donald pulled her close. "They'll see. Someday, and they'll understand." "Will they?" "They'll have to." A year passed. Then 2. Donald's hair went from gray to white. His knees complained more in the morning, and he couldn't work as long as he used to before his body demanded rest. But the home kept growing, kept improving. He added a skylight disguised as a break in the foliage, letting natural light pour into the main room during the day. He built a porch of sorts, a covered space between the roots where they could sit outside even in the rain. Helen's garden flourished. She grew tomatoes, squash, beans, and herbs. She learned which wild plants were edible and which were medicinal. She became, in her late 70s, a better gardener than she'd ever been because for the first time in her life, She was gardening for joy, not duty. Buster died in the 3rd year. He went peacefully, in his sleep, on the bed Donald had built for him by the stove. They buried him in the clearing, under a young fir tree that Helen said would grow tall and strong, nourished by his love. He was a good dog, Donald said, standing over the small grave. He was our family, Helen replied, the only one who never left. They adopted another dog a few months later, a stray that Donald found near the highway, thin and scared and missing half an ear. They named him Keeper, because Helen said that's what he was, a keeper. Keeper took to the underground life immediately. He learned to be quiet, to stay close, to bark only when something was truly wrong. He learned the sound of Donald's footsteps and would wag his tail before the hatch even opened. He learned to lie across Helen's feet in the evening, keeping her warm while she knit blankets they didn't need. But that made the home feel more like a home. 4 years passed. 4 years of quiet mornings and peaceful evenings, of coffee by firelight and meals made from food they'd grown and hunted themselves. 4 years of freedom from waiting, from hoping, from the slow poison of disappointment. And then, one Thursday in late October, Donald came back from town with a troubled look on his face. "What is it?" Helen asked. He sat down heavily at the table, setting a bag of supplies on the floor. "I saw a flyer in Millbrook. Someone's looking for us." Helen went very still. "The children?" "It didn't say. Just had our names and an old photo, the one from our anniversary party, I think. Have you seen this couple? Family seeking information. Reward offered." "A reward? $5,000. Helen's hands tightened on her coffee cup. "After 4 years. They're looking now. Something must have changed. They must need something. The mineral rights." Helen's voice was flat. "Remember? We never signed the final transfer. Catherine mentioned it before we left, and I said I wanted to think about it, and then we left. So they're not looking for us. They're looking for our signatures." Donald nodded slowly. "That's my guess." Helen stood up and walked to the far end of the room, where a small mirror hung above a basin of water. She looked at her reflection for a long moment. The white hair, the weathered face, the eyes that had seen too much and expected too little. "What do we do?" she asked. "That's up to you. If you want to see them." "I don't." The words came out sharp, and Helen seemed surprised by her own vehemence. She softened. "I don't know. Part of me does. Part of me wants to look them in the eyes and ask them how it felt to forget we existed. But another part of me doesn't want to give them the satisfaction. No." She turned to face him. "I don't want to leave this. What we've built, the peace we've found. If we go back into their world, even for a moment, we might lose it." Donald crossed the room and took her hands. "Then we don't go. We stay right here. They can look all they want, but they won't find us unless we let them. Can we do that? Just hide forever?" "We're not hiding, Helen. We're living. There's a difference." She leaned into him, and he held her the way he'd held her for 56 years, through births and deaths and everything in between. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." Above them, somewhere in the forest, the children were searching, but the children didn't know about these woods. They didn't know the old logging roads or the hidden springs, or the way the land folded into itself, keeping its secrets. Donald and Helen knew, and for now, that was enough. Keeper lay by the stove, tail wagging softly, as if he understood that everything was going to be all right. Richard couldn't sleep. He lay in a motel room in Millbrook, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like the state of Texas, listening to Michael snore in the next bed. It was 2 in the morning. They'd been in Oregon for 5 days now, and they were no closer to finding their parents than when they'd started. Catherine had flown in on day 3, bringing her laptop and her efficiency and her barely concealed irritation that this situation was taking so long to resolve. Derek had driven down from Seattle on day 4. Susan was arriving tomorrow. Only Michael had been here from the beginning, and Richard could see the toll it was taking on him, the way his hands shook when he drank his coffee, the way he flinched every time the phone rang. They'd put up flyers. They'd talked to everyone in town. They'd hired a private investigator who'd taken their money and produced nothing but a report that said, essentially, "Your parents don't want to be found," as if they didn't already know that. Richard got up and walked to the window. The town was dark except for a single streetlight and the neon glow of the diner sign, which Ruth apparently left on all night. He thought about going over there, getting a cup of coffee. sitting in the booth where his mother had once sat every Thursday. But the thought of facing Ruth again, of seeing that judgment in her eyes, kept him rooted to the spot. The busy ones. That's what Ruth had called them. And she was right. They had been busy. Too busy for Sunday phone calls, too busy for birthday visits, too busy to notice when their parents stopped reaching out, stopped trying, stopped believing that their children would ever come home. Richard pressed his forehead against the cold glass. He could see his reflection, ghostly and transparent, a man who looked older than his 47 years. When had he become this person? When had he stopped being the boy who used to sit on his father's shoulders at 4th of July parades, who used to help his mother in the garden, who used to believe that family meant something unbreakable? He knew the answer, of course. It had happened gradually, the way all erosions happen. One missed call became two. One skipped holiday became a pattern. One rationalization, they understand, they know I'm busy, I'll make it up to them, became a fortress of excuses, so tall he couldn't see over it anymore. And now his parents were gone, and all the excuses in the world couldn't bring them back. The next morning, Susan arrived. She looked exhausted from the red-eye flight, her eyes swollen like she'd been crying. She was the youngest of the five, the one who'd always been closest to their mother, and Richard could see the guilt eating at her like acid. "I should have noticed," she said, sitting in the diner while Ruth pointedly ignored their table. "When the Christmas card came back, I should have done something. I should have called, or driven out here, or..." "We all should have done something," Catherine interrupted. "Blaming yourself isn't productive. We need to focus on finding them." "Finding them," Susan repeated. "So they can sign your papers?" Catherine's jaw tightened. "That's not, isn't it? Be honest, Catherine. If this wasn't about the Whitfield deal, would we even be here?" The table went silent. Derek stared into his coffee. Michael looked out the window. Richard found he couldn't meet his sister's eyes. "That's what I thought," Susan said quietly. Catherine leaned forward, her voice controlled but sharp. "The Whitfield deal is worth $4 million, Susan. Split 5 ways, that's $800,000 each. Are you really going to pretend you don't care about that?" "I care about Mom and Dad." "So do I. The two things aren't mutually exclusive, aren't they?" Susan stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'm going for a walk. I need air." She left the diner, the bell above the door chiming in her wake. Richard watched her go, watched her walk past the hardware store and the post office, heading toward the edge of town where the forest began. "She's not wrong," Michael said quietly. "Michael? She's not wrong, Catherine. We're here because we need something, not because we finally remembered we have parents." Catherine opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. For a moment, her composure cracked, and Richard saw something underneath. Not just frustration, but fear. Fear that they'd waited too long. Fear that some damage couldn't be undone. "What do you want me to say?" she asked. "That I'm a terrible daughter? Fine, I'm a terrible daughter. We all are. But that doesn't change the fact that we need to find them, whatever the reason. They're 78 years old, living God knows where in the wilderness. What if something happens to them? What if Dad has another heart episode? What if Mom falls and breaks a hip? Then maybe we should have worried about that before we stuck them in a retirement home and forgot about them," Derek said. It was the first time he'd spoken all morning. Catherine turned to him. "You were there, Derek. You agreed with the decision." "I agreed because you and Richard made it sound like the only option. You said they couldn't take care of themselves anymore. You said the house was too much for them. You said..." He stopped, shaking his head. "You said a lot of things, and I was too lazy to question any of it." Richard thought about that. He remembered the family meeting, the one they'd had without their parents present, where they decided the future of two people who weren't in the room. He remembered the spreadsheets Catherine had prepared, showing the cost of maintaining the house versus the cost of the retirement community. He remembered the way they'd talked about their parents like problems to be solved, line items to be balanced. He remembered, too, the look on his father's face when they'd presented the plan, the way Donald Harmon had sat very still, very quiet, while his children explained why he couldn't be trusted to manage his own life anymore. The way he'd finally said, "If that's what you think is best," in a voice that held no fight left in it. Richard had told himself it was acceptance. He realized now it was surrender, the moment his father had given up on them. "We need to split up," Richard said. "Cover more ground." Susan had the right idea. We should be out there looking, not sitting here feeling sorry for ourselves. They spent the next 3 days searching. They drove every logging road, hiked every trail, knocked on the door of every cabin and homestead within 20 miles. They talked to hunters and hikers, forest rangers and hermits. Everyone had the same answer. They hadn't seen an elderly couple, didn't know anything about a hidden home, couldn't help. The private investigator's report had included a topographical map with areas circled where someone might feasibly build an off-grid dwelling, places with water access, natural shelter, flat enough ground for construction. There were dozens of such places in the national forest. Searching them all would take weeks. On the 8th day, Richard went out alone. He told the others he was following up on a lead, but the truth was simpler. He needed to get away from his siblings, from their guilt and their justifications, and the way they kept looking at him like he had answers. He was the oldest. He was supposed to know what to do, but he didn't know anything anymore. He drove until the paved road turned to gravel, then until the gravel turned to dirt, then until the dirt became so overgrown he had to stop and continue on foot. He walked for hours, deeper into the forest than he'd ever been, until the trees grew so tall and so thick that the sunlight barely reached the ground. It was beautiful here. Richard had forgotten what real wilderness looked like, not the manicured nature of city parks or the controlled wildness of ski resorts, but genuine, untouched forest. The kind of place where you could walk for days without seeing another person. The kind of place where you could disappear. Is that what you wanted, Dad? He thought. To disappear? To become invisible? The way we made you feel? He stopped to rest on a fallen log, drinking water from a bottle, listening to the birds. A woodpecker drummed somewhere in the distance. A creek burbled nearby. The air smelled like pine and earth and something else, something he couldn't identify. Smoke, very faint, but definitely smoke. Richard stood up, turning slowly, trying to locate the source. It was impossible to tell direction in this dense forest, where sound and smell bounced and scattered. But someone was burning wood nearby. Someone was living out here. He walked toward where he thought the smell was strongest, pushing through underbrush, climbing over fallen trees. After 20 minutes, he emerged into a small clearing at the base of an enormous Douglas fir, the biggest tree he'd ever seen, its trunk wider than his car, its roots spreading out like the tentacles of some ancient creature. The clearing was empty, just the tree, some rocks, a few small plants growing in patches of sunlight. No cabin, no campsite, no sign of human habitation, but the smell of smoke was stronger here. Richard walked around the tree, examining the ground. Nothing. He looked up into the canopy, wondering if someone had built a treehouse. Nothing. He was about to give up when his foot caught on something and he stumbled. Looking down, he saw what had tripped him, a seam in the forest floor, a straight line where there shouldn't be one, hidden beneath leaves and moss, but visible now that he was looking for it. His heart began to pound. He knelt and brushed away the debris, revealing the edge of what looked like a wooden hatch. It was perfectly camouflaged, covered in living moss that had been carefully cultivated to blend with the surrounding ground. If he hadn't tripped, he never would have seen it. For a long moment, Richard just stared. His parents were down there. He knew it with a certainty that went beyond logic. His father had built this. His father, who had built their childhood treehouse, who had built the deck and the workshop and 100 other things, had built a home underground, hidden from the world, hidden from his own children. Richard reached for the hatch. His fingers touched the moss, felt the wood beneath, and then he stopped. If you find us, it will be because you wanted to, not because you needed something. His mother's words from the letter she'd written, knowing they'd probably never read it, that they'd probably never come looking, that they'd probably never care enough to try. But he did need something. That was the terrible truth. He was here because of the Whitfield deal, because of money, because of mineral rights that had suddenly become valuable. He was here because his parents had something he wanted, not because he wanted his parents. What would happen if he opened that hatch? He'd find them. Yes, he'd get the signature. The deal would close, the money would flow, everyone would go back to their lives. But what about his parents? Would they go back to the retirement community they'd hated? Would they return to a world that had no place for them? Or would they stay here, in this impossible home they'd built, and simply refuse to come out? Richard sat back on his heels, his hand still resting on the hidden hatch. The smoke smell had faded, or maybe he'd imagined it. The forest was quiet around him, waiting. He thought about his father teaching him to ride a bike, running alongside with one hand on the seat, promising not to let go. He thought about his mother staying up all night when he was sick, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, singing songs she probably thought he'd forgotten. He thought about Sunday dinners and summer vacations, and the way the house used to smell like cinnamon at Christmas. He thought about the last time he'd called, really called, not just a quick check-in but an actual conversation. He couldn't remember. It had been so long that the memory had simply faded away. Slowly, Richard stood up. He looked at the hatch for another long moment. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come. He didn't tell his siblings what he'd found. That night, he lay awake again. But this time, the thoughts were different. He wasn't thinking about the deal or the money or even the guilt. He was thinking about his parents, down there in the earth, living a life they'd chosen after their children had refused to choose them. Were they happy? Ruth had said they were. The woman at the diner had said his mother talked about finding purpose, about being young again. They'd built something with their own hands, something hidden and secret, and entirely their own. And here he was, ready to take it away from them. The next morning, Richard called a family meeting. They gathered in Catherine's motel room, coffee cups and laptops scattered across every surface. "I think we should go home," Richard said. Catherine stared at him. "What?" "I think we should leave them alone." "Richard, the Whitfield deal." "I don't care about the Whitfield deal." The words hung in the air. Michael sat up straighter. Susan's eyes went wide. Derek set down his coffee cup with a soft click. "You don't mean that," Catherine said. "I do." Richard walked to the window, looking out at the forest that held his parents' secret. "We abandoned them, Catherine. We stuck them in a home they hated and then forgot they existed. And now, for the first time in years, they're happy. Ruth said so. The guy at the hardware store said so. Everyone we've talked to says they seemed peaceful, content, like they'd found something they'd been missing. They're living in the wilderness at 78 years old. They're living the life they chose. Don't we owe them that much? After everything we put them through?" Susan spoke up quietly. "What about making things right? What about apologizing?" Richard turned to face her. "Would you want our apology if you were them? Would you trust it?" Susan didn't answer. "We can't undo what we did," Richard continued. "We can't give them back the years we ignored them, but we can give them this. We can walk away and let them live in peace." "And the mineral rights?" Catherine asked. Her voice was strained. "Let them lapse. Let Whitfield find another deal. It's just money, Catherine. It's $4 million. And they're our parents." The room fell silent. Richard watched his siblings process what he was saying. He saw the conflict in their faces, the greed warring with the guilt, the practicality fighting the regret. Finally, Derek spoke. "How do we even know they're still out there? How do we know they're okay?" "We don't," Richard admitted. "But I think if something had happened to them, we'd know. This town is small. People talk. If an elderly couple had been found hurt or sick in the forest, Ruth would have heard about it. That's not exactly reassuring." "No, but it's something." Catherine stood up and walked to the window, standing beside Richard. For a long moment, she didn't speak. "I keep thinking about the Christmas cards," she said finally. "The ones Mom sent that came back unopened. 23 of them. For 2 years she kept trying to reach us, and we just didn't notice." "I know. What kind of person doesn't notice their mother trying to reach them? The kind of person who's too busy being successful to remember what matters." Catherine's composure finally cracked. Her shoulders shook, and when she turned to face Richard, there were tears on her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Richard pulled her into a hug, and for the first time since they were children, his sister cried in his arms. They left Millbrook the next day. Richard was the last to go, standing in the parking lot of the motel, looking toward the mountains where his parents lived their hidden life. He'd written a letter. He didn't know if they'd ever receive it, didn't know if Ruth would agree to hold it in case they came to town, didn't even know if it said the right things. But he'd written it anyway. "Dear Mom and Dad, I found your home, the one beneath the tree. I didn't open the hatch because I realized I hadn't earned the right. I'm not going to pretend I came here for the right reasons. I came because we needed your signature on some papers. Business, money, the usual things that seem so important until they're not. But somewhere along the way, I remembered who I used to be. I remembered the father who taught me to build things, and the mother who taught me that some things can't be measured in dollars. I remembered that you gave me everything, and I gave you nothing in return. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not even asking to see you. I just wanted you to know that we finally understand what we did, and we're sorry. Not sorry because we need something. Sorry because we finally see you, really see you, as people who deserved so much better than the children you raised. If you ever want to reach out, you know where to find us. But if you don't, I understand. You've built a beautiful life out there. You've earned your peace. I love you. I should have said it more when it mattered. Richard. He gave the letter to Ruth, who took it with an unreadable expression. You're leaving, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, without finding them. I found them, Richard said. I just decided not to disturb them. Ruth studied him for a long moment. Something shifted in her face. Not quite approval, but maybe the absence of disapproval. I'll hold on to this, she said, tucking the letter into her apron pocket. Margaret comes in sometimes when she thinks no one's paying attention. If I see her, I'll make sure she gets it. Thank you. Don't thank me. You should have been here years ago. I know. Ruth nodded once, then turned back to her coffee pot, dismissing him. Richard drove away from Millbrook as the sun began to set, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in those trees, his parents were preparing for evening. Maybe his father was bringing in firewood. Maybe his mother was starting dinner. Maybe they were sitting together in their hidden home, two people who had found each other again after the world had tried to tear them apart. He hoped so. He hoped they had many more years of quiet mornings and peaceful evenings, of coffee by firelight and the comfort of each other's company. He hoped, someday, he might deserve to see them again. But that day wasn't today. 3 weeks later, a woman with white hair walked into Ruth's diner on a Thursday morning. She ordered coffee and pie, same as always, and sat in the booth by the window, watching the autumn leaves fall. Ruth brought her order over, along with an envelope. Someone left this for you, Ruth said. About 3 weeks back. Helen Harmon looked at the envelope. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Richard's cramped, hurried script, so different from Donald's careful letters. Thank you, she said quietly. Ruth lingered for a moment. They seemed different at the end. Your children, especially the oldest one. He seemed like he was finally seeing something he'd missed before. Helen didn't respond. She just held the envelope, feeling its weight, wondering what words her son had finally found after all these years of silence. She didn't open it in the diner. She tucked it into her coat pocket and finished her coffee, watching the world go by outside the window. Then she paid her bill, said goodbye to Ruth, and walked back into the forest. That evening, by the light of the fire in their home beneath the tree, she read the letter aloud to Donald. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a long time. Keeper lay between them, his head resting on Helen's foot, his tail giving an occasional thump against the floor. He found us, Donald finally said. He found us and didn't come in. That must have been hard for him. Helen folded the letter carefully, running her fingers along the creases. Yes, I think it was. What do you want to do? She looked at her husband, at the face she'd loved for 56 years, at the hands that had built this impossible home, at the eyes that still looked at her like she was the most important thing in the world. I want to think about it, she said. I want to take my time. Donald nodded. We have time. Yes. Helen smiled, leaning into his shoulder. We finally do. Outside, above the hidden hatch, the forest settled into night. Stars emerged between the branches of the ancient Douglas fir. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, and another answered. And beneath the earth, an old couple sat together by the fire, holding a letter that might be a beginning or might be an ending, depending on what they decided. For the first time in 4 years, the future felt uncertain. But uncertainty, Helen realized, wasn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it meant that doors were opening. Sometimes it meant that broken things could start to heal. She wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet, maybe not ever. But she was willing to wonder. And that, she thought, was a start. Helen didn't respond to the letter for 3 months. She read it dozens of times. So many that the paper began to soften at the creases, the ink fading where her fingers touched it most. She kept it in a wooden box Donald had made her, alongside other precious things. The last photograph of Buster, a lock of hair from each of her children when they were babies, the wedding ring her mother had worn for 60 years. Donald didn't push. He'd learned, in 56 years of marriage, when to speak and when to stay quiet. He watched Helen turn the decision over in her mind, examining it from every angle, and he waited. Winter came to the forest. Snow fell thick and silent, covering their hidden hatch, making the world above a blank white page. They stayed warm in their underground home, the wood stove crackling, Keeper curled at their feet. They read books they'd read before, and listened to the radio, and played cards by lamplight. They were, Helen realized, still happy. Even with the letter sitting in its box, even with the question it raised hanging over them, they were still happy. That meant something. "I've been thinking," she said one evening in late January, as snow continued to fall somewhere far above their heads. Donald looked up from the knife he was sharpening. "About Richard?" "About all of them. But yes, mostly Richard." "And?" Helen set down her knitting. "I'm not ready to forgive them. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. What they did, what they chose to do, over and over, for years, that doesn't just go away because one of them finally wrote a letter." "No," Donald agreed. "It doesn't, but—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I keep thinking about something my mother used to say. She said that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. Your mother was a wise woman. She was. And I don't want to spend whatever years I have left being angry. Not at them, not at anyone." Helen met her husband's eyes. "I want to write back." Donald nodded slowly. "What do you want to say?" "I don't know yet, but I think I need to see him, Richard. Just him, just once. I need to look at my son and see if there's anything left of the boy I raised. And if there isn't?" Helen's smile was sad. "Then at least I'll know, and I can stop wondering." She wrote the letter that night, by the light of the oil lamp, while Donald slept and Keeper snored softly in his bed by the stove. It took her 4 attempts to get the words right. "Richard, I received your letter. It took me a long time to decide how to respond, or whether to respond at all. You were right that you hadn't earned the right to open that hatch. You were right that you came for the wrong reasons. And you were right that what you did, what all of you did, cannot be undone. But your father taught me long ago that people can change. He was a stubborn, prideful man when I married him, and he's still stubborn, but he learned to be gentle. He learned to listen. He learned that being strong doesn't mean being hard. I want to see if you've learned anything. There's a place in the forest, about a mile from the old fire lookout on Deer Ridge. You'll find a clearing with a creek running through it, and a flat rock big enough for 2 people to sit on. Be there on the first Saturday of March, at sunrise. Come alone. Don't tell your siblings. If you're not there, I'll understand. If you are, we'll talk. That's all I can promise. Your mother." She gave the letter to Ruth on her next trip to town. Ruth took it without comment, but her eyes were curious. "He'll get this?" Helen asked. "I have his address. I'll mail it today." "Thank you." Ruth hesitated, then spoke. "Margaret, Helen, whatever your name really is, are you sure about this?" "No," Helen admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." The first Saturday of March dawned clear and cold. Helen woke before the sun, dressing quietly so as not to wake Donald, though she suspected he was already awake and simply pretending otherwise. He knew where she was going. They'd talked about it the night before. "Do you want me to come?" he'd asked. "No, this is something I need to do alone. What if he doesn't show? Then I'll come home, and we'll have breakfast, and life will go on." Donald had taken her hand. "And if he does show? What then?" Helen had no answer for that. She climbed the ladder, pushed open the hatch, and emerged into a world transformed by early spring. The snow was mostly gone, replaced by patches of green, and the first tentative wildflowers. The air smelled like wet earth and new growth. Above her, the ancient Douglas fir stood as it had stood for 4 centuries, watching over its small secrets. Keeper whined at the bottom of the ladder, wanting to come. "Not this time," Helen said softly. "Stay with Donald." She walked for nearly an hour, following trails she'd memorized over 4 years. The forest was waking around her, birds calling, squirrels chattering, a deer watching her pass with liquid eyes. By the time she reached the clearing with the creek, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten. The flat rock was empty. Helen sat down, pulling her coat tighter against the morning chill. She watched the sky change colors, pink and gold and pale blue, as the sun crept toward the horizon. She listened to the creek, to the birds, to her own breathing. She waited. The sun had fully risen, had climbed a hand's width above the trees, when she finally accepted that Richard wasn't coming. She felt something settle in her chest. Not quite grief, not quite relief, something in between. She'd offered an olive branch, and it had been declined. Now she knew. She stood up, joints protesting, preparing to make the long walk home, and then she heard footsteps. Richard emerged from the trees, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were rumpled, his face unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring at her like she might be an apparition. "I got lost," he said. His voice cracked. "I've been walking in circles for 2 hours. I thought I'd missed you. I thought." He couldn't finish the sentence. Helen sat back down on the rock. After a moment, she patted the space beside her. "Sit," she said. "You look terrible." Richard crossed the clearing on unsteady legs. He sat down heavily, leaving a careful distance between them. Up close, Helen could see the gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes. When had her boy gotten so old? "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for inviting me." They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the creek flow past. A fish jumped, catching an early insect. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker began its morning percussion. "I don't know where to start," Richard finally said. "Neither do I. The letter you left in the boxes, the one you wrote before you disappeared. I've read it so many times, the paper's falling apart. I keep trying to find the moment where everything went wrong. The moment where I stopped being your son and started being whatever I became." "There wasn't one moment," Helen said. "That's not how it works. It was 1,000 small choices, each one easier than the last, each one taking you a little further away until you looked up and couldn't see us anymore." "I know. Do you? Do you really understand what it felt like to sit in that retirement community, waiting for the phone to ring, hoping that maybe this week, this month, this year, one of our children might remember we existed?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Mom, your father stopped hoping first. He's always been better at letting go than me, but I kept trying. 23 cards, Richard. I sent 23 cards to children who couldn't be bothered to update their addresses, who couldn't be bothered to call and say, 'Mom, I moved.' 23 times I wrote your names on envelopes, put stamps on them, walked them to the mailbox, and waited for responses that never came. I'm sorry. I know you are. But sorry doesn't fill the empty chair at Christmas. Sorry doesn't answer the phone at 3 in the morning when your father had chest pains and I didn't know who else to call. Sorry doesn't," Helen's voice broke. She took a breath, steadied herself. "Sorry doesn't give us back the years we lost." Richard was crying now, silently, tears tracking down his weathered face. He didn't try to wipe them away. "When I found your home," he said, "when I was standing over that hatch with my hand on the wood, I realized something. I realized that you and Dad had built a life without us. A real life, not just survival. You'd made something beautiful, something hidden, something that was entirely yours. And I was about to barge in and take it away because I needed a signature on some papers. The mineral rights." "Yes." Helen nodded slowly. "I wondered if that's what this was about." "It's not. Not anymore." Richard turned to face her. "I told Catherine to let the deal collapse. I told all of them that some things are more important than money." Michael and Susan agreed. Derek came around eventually. "Catherine," he shrugged. "Catherine is still Catherine, but she signed the withdrawal papers anyway. You gave up $4 million? I gave up money that was never really mine. Those mineral rights belong to you and Dad. If you want to sell them, that's your choice. If you want to let them sit there forever, that's your choice too. But I wasn't going to be the reason you had to make that decision." Helen studied her son's face, looking for the catch, the angle, the self-interest hiding behind the noble words. She'd learned to look for such things in the years since her children had betrayed her trust. She didn't find it. "Your father built that home with his own hands," she said quietly. 76 years old, bad back, bad heart, and he dug into the earth and created something from nothing. Do you know why? Because you needed somewhere to live? Because he wanted to prove that we still could, that we weren't useless, weren't finished, weren't just waiting to die in some sterile room with fluorescent lights, and nurses who called us dear like we were children. Helen's voice hardened. "You took everything from us, Richard. Our home, our independence, our dignity, and then you forgot we existed. Your father built that home to prove that we were still people, still capable, still alive. I know. Do you? Do you understand what it means to be discarded by the people you raised? To give 50 years of your life to your children and have them throw you away like an old appliance?" "No," Richard admitted. "I don't understand. I can't understand, but I want to try." The sun had climbed higher, warming the clearing, burning off the morning mist. Helen watched a butterfly land on a nearby flower. its wings opening and closing slowly. "When you were 7, she said, "you fell out of the treehouse your father built, broke your arm in 2 places. Do you remember?" "I remember the cast. It was green. You picked green because it was my favorite color. You said you wanted to carry a piece of me with you while you healed." Helen smiled faintly. "I thought about that a lot in the retirement community. I wondered where that boy went, the one who wanted to carry a piece of me with him." "He got lost," Richard said, "somewhere between law school and the corner office and the endless meetings that seemed so important. He got lost, and he didn't even notice he was gone. And now?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "Now he's trying to find his way back. He doesn't know if he can. He doesn't know if he deserves to, but he's trying." Helen reached out and took her son's hand. His fingers were cold, trembling slightly. She held on anyway. "That's all I wanted to know," she said. They sat together as the morning grew warmer, not speaking much, just existing in the same space. Helen told Richard about the home beneath the tree, not where it was, but what it was like. The firelight, the wood stove, the smell of coffee in the morning. She told him about Keeper, about the garden, about the skylight Donald had installed so they could watch the rain. Richard listened. He didn't ask to see it. He didn't ask to meet his father. He just listened, and for the first time in years, Helen felt like she was being heard. "I should get back," she finally said. "Donald will worry." "Can I?" Richard stopped himself. "Never mind." "What? Can I write to you?" "Not often, just sometimes. To let you know how we're doing, to ask how you're doing." Helen considered this. It was such a small request. A letter now and then, words on paper, delivered through Ruth, keeping a thread of connection without demanding more than she could give. "You can write," she said. "I can't promise I'll always respond, but you can write. Thank you." She stood, brushing off her coat. Richard stood too, and for a moment they faced each other awkwardly. Two people who had once been mother and son, trying to figure out what they were now. "Richard," Helen said, "what you did, choosing not to open that hatch, choosing to walk away, that meant something. It meant you finally saw us as people instead of problems. I need you to know that. I should have seen it decades ago." "Yes, you should have, but you see it now, and that's not nothing." She turned to go, then paused. "The mineral rights," she said. "Your father and I talked about it. We're going to sign the papers." Richard blinked. "You are? Money doesn't matter to us. We have everything we need. But," she hesitated, "we're going to put it in a trust, for your children, for all our grandchildren." "We've never met them, Richard. You never brought them to visit. And then we disappeared. And now there are children in this world who carry our blood and don't even know our names. Mom, we're not doing it for you. We're doing it for them. They didn't choose to have parents who forgot their grandparents. They deserve something from us, even if it's only money." Helen's voice softened. "Maybe someday, when they're older, you'll tell them about us, about the crazy old couple who lived under a tree. Maybe they'll understand something about family that their parents forgot." Richard's face crumpled. "I'll tell them. I promise. I'll tell them everything. See that you do." Helen walked away, disappearing into the forest, following paths that only she and Donald knew. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel her son's eyes on her until the trees swallowed her whole. When she reached the hatch, Donald was waiting outside, sitting on a root with Keeper beside him. He looked up as she approached, his eyes searching her face. "How did it go?" Helen sat down beside him, leaning into his shoulder. "He came. He listened. He cried. Did you forgive him?" "No, not yet. Maybe not ever." She took her husband's hand. "But I opened a door, just a crack, just enough to let a little light through." Donald nodded, pulling her close. "That's enough for now." "Yes," Helen agreed. "It's enough." Spring came fully to the forest. The trees leafed out, the flowers bloomed, the creek ran high with snowmelt. Helen planted her garden while Donald built a new shelf for her sewing room. Keeper grew a little grayer around the muzzle, but still wagged his tail every time they came home. Letters arrived through Ruth, one every few weeks. Richard wrote about his life, about his children, about the small changes he was making. He'd cut his hours at work. He'd started having dinner with his family every night. He'd begun teaching his son to build things with his hands, the way his father had once taught him. Helen didn't respond to every letter, but she responded to some. Short notes, a few lines, letting him know they were well, letting him know she'd read his words. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was something smaller, more fragile, more honest. It was two people learning to see each other again, across a distance that might never fully close. One evening in late May, as the sun set and the forest filled with golden light, Helen and Donald sat on their little porch between the roots of the ancient tree. Keeper lay at their feet, dreaming whatever dreams old dogs dream. The wood stove had been cold for weeks, but the evening was warm enough that they didn't miss it. "Do you think he'll ever come here?" Donald asked. "To the home?" Helen considered the question. "Maybe. Someday. When he's earned it." "How will he earn it?" "By showing up. Year after year. Letter after letter. By proving that he means what he says. That this isn't just guilt that will fade when the next distraction comes along." She looked at her husband. "We gave them 50 years of showing up. It's their turn now." Donald nodded slowly. "And if he does earn it? If he proves himself?" Helen smiled. The first full smile she'd allowed herself since this whole journey began. "Then I'll open the hatch, and I'll show him what his father built. And maybe, if he's lucky, I'll let him stay for coffee." "Just coffee?" "For now. We'll see about the rest." Donald laughed, a sound that still made Helen's heart lift after 56 years. "You're a hard woman, Helen Harmon." "I learned from a hard man." They sat together as darkness fell, watching the stars emerge one by one through the canopy above. Somewhere out there, in cities and suburbs and lives they could barely imagine anymore, their children were living their complicated lives, maybe thinking about them, maybe not. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was this: the warmth of Donald's hand in hers, the soft sound of Keeper's breathing, the smell of pine and earth and home. What mattered was that they had built something that couldn't be taken away, a life that belonged entirely to them. What mattered was that they had survived being forgotten, and in surviving, had remembered who they really were. "I love you," Helen said. "I love you too." Above them, the ancient Douglas fir stood as it had stood for 400 years, keeping its secrets, sheltering its small family, reaching toward the stars. And beneath its roots, in a home carved from earth and hope and stubborn determination, two people who had been thrown away by the world had found something the world couldn't touch. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but the possibility of it, glowing like an ember in the dark, waiting to see if anyone would have the courage to breathe it back to life.